Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Kluche from 680 CJOB. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us on a generally warm Winnipeg night. We want to thank our sponsors, Power to Change Campus Group, Grant Memorial Church, Kelowna Park Alliance Church, along with several private donors. Please, polite round of applause. By the way, you'll know, polite round of applause, thunderous round of applause. There's a whole range there for you. Ladies and gentlemen, one of Canada's best features as a country is that we are a pluralistic nation. Canadians strive to make people of all race, color, and creed feel welcome. Canada, being such a society that we value, that very few Canadians are ashamed of. Indeed, we're proud to house a pluralistic society. When it comes to the topic, though, of worldviews, many of us make the leap that because these issues are personal, they should therefore be private. Well, this is a mistake. The old saying, people fear what they do not understand, comes to mind. The step of privatizing our various different worldviews in this society, this pluralistic society, is in fact the first step really towards ignorance. It is precisely when we stop talking, engaging, and understanding each other's differences that this ideal is threatened. Tonight we wish to confront the urge to privatize our differences and demonstrate that these most serious topics and questions belong in the open, right here on public display for all of us to consume. So tonight's topic is there hope for the future? As you look into the future, what exactly is that? What worries you most? What gives you the most hope? We have three perspectives here, and I'm sure many more in our audience. And we are giving each speaker here an opportunity to lecture 15 minutes on the topic, specifically with their own personal worldview and their convictions. No doubt, as we enjoy the lectures tonight, we will see that each other's view approaches words like hope and future quite differently. The goal of our gathering here tonight is to demonstrate that contrast does not necessarily need to bring conflict, but rather contrast can bring clarity. The goal of all of us tonight, including you, is to understand the differences between the worldviews and decide for yourselves if these differences in fact make a difference. So here are the ground rules, and there are a few. Each participant will have 15 minutes to speak. I will allow for a few minutes overrun, but I will be stopping you at 20 minutes. And I do have the hook if necessary. I'm here to moderate, to sometimes stoke the fires, sometimes to put out the fires if need be. You are encouraged to text your questions as soon as they come to you. We are collating them, and I will have them here on the computer screen, so feel free. We will also have open mics during the second part of this evening. I will try the best way I can to capture the question we ask you in the world of Twitter, to keep them to 140 characters or less. So again, text messaging instructions are on the screen behind me. The traditional hand raised, and the usher will approach with a cordless microphone. We will have a 10 to 15 minute intermission after our initial lectures. Again, the questions that are relevant tonight, our panelists are encouraged to chime in later on, even if the question's not directly asked of them. And I'll discuss a little bit more about this in our second half. Those are the rules. We just ask you to be respectful and mindful of the differences, and please accommodate me if I say, let's keep it brief. I've done many of these before where people want to indeed lecture themselves. Now we have the three here, and we ask you to keep your comments and your questions short, direct, and to the point. In a democracy, sometimes we do coin flips, and we have done that to determine the, and Shahina, do we need a space heater for you, by the way? It is kind of cold in here. So before we bring up our speakers, I just kind of to break the ice, if you will, and I'm allowed, I think, 3 or 4 more cold weather jokes. By the way, do I have 2, Ked? Diana Goods is here. She is representing the humanist worldview. We'll meet her in just a moment. Shahina Siddiqui is here representing the Muslim worldview, and Dr. Andy Bannister is here representing the Christian worldview. And again, I ask you to welcome them and give them a thunderous round of applause. All right, Diana, pick up your microphone. Diana, pick up your microphone, just for your microphone. Because Diana, how many times have you actually spoken in public in an audience like this?
Never.
Okay. So we're letting you go first.
Yes, Andy was gracious enough. I guess after he saw how I performed on the radio the other night, he decided to give me first pick.
All right, just before we bring you up here to present the humanist perspective, let's find out a little bit about you. Native Winnipeg?
Yes, I was born in Winnipeg. I've lived here my whole life, except for 3 years. My husband and I braved moving into northern Manitoba, into a First Nations community where we lived for 3 years. But the pull of family brought me back to Winnipeg, and here we are.
You are on the executive board of the Humanists, and again, I apologize here, but the print is so very small here. Atheist Agnostics of Manitoba, and as a librarian, you're also a registered nurse.
Yes, I've been a registered nurse for 20 years. I work at the Riverview Health Centre. I work with a geriatric population, and I love my job.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome again, representing the humanist worldview, Diana Goods.
Okay, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for coming out on this wickedly cold Winnipeg winter night. I'd like to thank all of the people who organized the event and to my fellow panelists for participating. I appreciate being invited to speak on this question of how my worldview affects my hopes and fears for the future. I particularly want to thank Dave Kenny for getting the ball rolling on this event and approaching our organization to ask for our participation. When Dave first approached us, I think he was hoping that we would be able to put up a volunteer with the expertise and credentials to match those of the other panelists. But sadly, we don't know any professional atheists or humanists, so to fit that bill. During the time that Dave was beginning to organize the event, the world-renowned humanist philosopher A.C. Grayling was in Winnipeg to give the inaugural talk on human rights at our new Human Rights Museum. It would have been nice if he could have extended his Winnipeg visit for a few months to give us a hand, but that was not to be. So you have to make do with hearing from me. I'm just an ordinary woman with a lifelong love of books and a desire to learn about the world. So I hope you'll be forgiving of me if my delivery is less than polished. When I was practicing my presentation a few nights ago with some of my humanist friends, they tried to give me some advice and gently suggested that perhaps I could try sounding a little less robotic. I considered their advice, but maybe robotic is exactly the angle that I should play up, given the many discussions on this topic involving morality and free will that often end up with religious people asking that very question of us. To begin, I will talk a little bit about my views and how I came to hold them. I describe myself as an atheist and a humanist. The label atheist describes what I don't believe, and the humanist label describes what I do believe. Atheism is not a worldview. It's simply an answer to a question. Atheism means I don't believe in any gods. I have no belief in gods, demons, angels, or spirits. I see no evidence for the supernatural. Atheists do not necessarily agree on anything but this one question. Their beliefs on anything else are diverse. No one speaks for atheism, and getting them to agree on anything has often been likened to herding cats. I was raised by Christian parents, and as most children do, I believed in the God that my parents told me about. However, I recall that my doubts surfaced quite early when I realized that other people believed in different gods. How could we be sure that ours was the right one? When I expressed some of these concerns and questioned our minister, the answers that I received were unsatisfying. As I grew up, religion just became something that was irrelevant to my life. By the time I was an adult, I considered myself an agnostic, but I didn't put too much thought into the bigger questions of life. I was busy for the next few years with school, beginning my career, and getting married. Religion just didn't factor much into my daily life, and I mostly adopted a live and let live attitude. Two significant things happened to awaken my interest and start me on my journey to where I am today, an activist, atheist, and a humanist. I had always loved to read, and one day, bored with nothing on my shelves to interest me, I happened to pick up a copy of a book from my husband's shelf. This book was called Wonderful Life by the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. Gould was a scientist with a gift of being able to convey quite complicated ideas so that the average reader could understand them. His writing was exactly what I needed to spark my interest in science. Of course, I had learned about evolution in school, and I understood that we're all descended from a common ancestor, but his writing really brought it to life for me. I learned more about all the different lines of evidence, including the fossil record, the geographical distribution of species, and the deeper evidence in our DNA. All of these lines of evidence converge and confirm the shared ancestry of all living things. As I learned more about evolution and the journey that it described for our species, it became more clear to me that creation stories were preposterous, and the likelihood of any kind of designer god having a hand in the process, a belief held on to by many more liberal religious people, became less believable. And truthfully, if there is a designer god, I'd like to take issue with him about these very imperfect eyes he gave me. Discoveries in anthropology and archaeology revealed our ancestors that shared many of our human traits. They cared for their weaker members, and they created amazing art. As I learned more about what science can tell us about our history, particularly through the genetic research that reveals that we're all descended from a small group of humans in Africa only 50 to 60,000 years ago, it really brought home to me the connection that we all share with each other. So began my journey of discovery. I started to read many science-based works, and my eyes were open to a lot of intriguing ideas. This newfound appreciation for what science can tell us about the world led me to explore other ideas as well. I delved into reading about religion, philosophy, psychology, morality, critical thinking. I began to think about my thinking, to examine if the things that I believed were actually true. I tried to look objectively at my beliefs. Did I hold them because I wanted them to be true? Or because they were comfortable and familiar? Or could I demonstrate that they aligned with evidence? Was I being open-minded and rational? With this approach of open-minded inquiry, I examined the arguments for the existence of God to the best of my ability, and I found them all wanting. Even the most sophisticated arguments by skilled philosophers and apologists, and believe me, I have watched more William Lane Craig videos than you can shake a stick at. The kind of arguments that show that there's at best no logical contradiction to some kind of deistic creator God, were not convincing enough to demonstrate the type of God that most people believe in. To get to this type of God, the kind that answers prayers, changes lives, performs miracles, and takes an interest in what moral choices humans make, usually involves further communication in the form of a holy book or personal revelation. If there is a God who cares about us, one has to wonder why this message of great importance would be conveyed in such a way. Religious people can argue about whether or not their books are inerrant or inspired, but in the end, the evidence, as demonstrated by the many different flavors of religion that we see today, all with contradictory doctrines, show that there's no reliable way to get to the truth. Why is it that believers in even the same faith tradition can hold such contradictory positions? They're all reading from the same book. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find even a dozen people in any church, mosque, or synagogue that held identical views on various moral questions. And blaming this entire predicament on sin is not a coherent answer, for if sin prevents one from proper interpretation of these books on some questions, then surely the same sinful nature must be clouding one's judgment on everything else. In the end, they all rely on faith, on believing with insufficient evidence. Right around this time that I was beginning to explore some of these questions, the second thing happened that would affect the direction my life would take. My husband and I became parents, and as it does for many, becoming a parent means you no longer consider things just from your own perspective. Being responsible for this person that we had created made me care more about what kind of world we had brought her into. I had the desire for my child to live in a world where she would be safe, free to pursue her interests, and live a meaningful life with respect for herself and others. And then 9/11 happened. The world watched in horror as those towers came down. We saw the death and destruction brought to us by those men of great faith. We can probably argue about the specifics of what motivated those horrific actions, but I don't think anyone would seriously question whether or not faith played a big part. This terrible act of terror brought home the realization that for many people, this world, my world, was just a temporary stopping place, a testing ground for another, better one that awaited them. All this for a belief in an afterlife, a belief that has no more evidence for its existence than a few words written down by men hundreds or thousands of years ago. This shocking event made it all too clear to me the danger that our world faced by those people who believe that faith is a reliable way of interpreting the world. I could no longer believe that other people's beliefs, religious beliefs, were inconsequential. People's beliefs inform their actions and have consequences that affect us all. This fear and my hope for a better world for my child has motivated me to do what I can to change this world for the better. And there is a better way to discover what's true about the universe, and that's through the scientific method. Science gives us a way to objectively look at the world, to ask questions through experiment and testing. It allows us to gather knowledge in a systematic way, to correct for our biases, and to correct itself as more information is gathered. This ability to self-correct is one of its greatest strengths. Science has done more for humanity in the past few hundred years than millions of hands clasped in prayer did for countless generations before. Will theologians argue about the specific requirements of salvation, the miracle of the Quran, or comb their holy texts to find complicated rationalizations for contradictions? Science has been busy discovering germ theory, antibiotics, and vaccines. Science has given us electricity, clean water, cell phones, and seedless watermelon. Through the eyes of the Hubble telescope, we can literally look into the distant past. while religion, with its adherence to dogma and doctrine, leaves many people stuck in the past, trying to find a way to reconcile the teachings and rules of ancient civilizations with our modern world. Both religion and science seek to find answers to questions, but while religion encourages people to be satisfied with not knowing, comfortable with inserting God into the gaps in our knowledge, science sees those gaps as an opportunity and a challenge to continue looking. Religion gives us answers that can't be questioned. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. We can do better. This brings me to the secular humanist philosophy. Humanism encompasses the scientific method when it comes to understanding how the universe works, and using empathy and compassion to guide our ethical decision-making. Humanism is not an easy path, as it means accepting that we don't always have an answer. It has no dogma. With no holy books to tell us what to do, we must take responsibility for our own lives. We're answerable only to ourselves and the other creatures that we share this planet with. We must combat the evil and suffering that we see, as there's no evidence of any divine judge who will step in and even things up in the end. Whatever meaning is to be found must be found within ourselves. As Douglas Adams said, if you want meaning in your life, do something meaningful. Humanism allows us to take advantage of our natural inclinations. Evolution has equipped us with these huge brains capable of using rational thought to guide our actions. And as social creatures with empathy, we have the ability to see things from another person's perspective, to share in their pleasures and sorrows. Science has shown us that even very young infants and children have a sense of fairness, compassion, and justice. These are the building blocks of morality. It's in us to care. When I look to the future, I can see that religion is on the run. The events of 9/11, which put religion in the spotlight, and the rise of the information age, where people can access information almost instantly, has dealt a blow to religion around the world. In countries where people have functioning democracies and freedom to choose, they are walking away from religion. In North America and Europe, the nuns are on the rise. Christianity, desperately trying to hold on to its spot, has responded to that by reinventing itself. The word religion has too many negative associations, so it has now become a personal relationship instead. Traditional churches stand empty, while the rise of the megachurch attempts to recapture those who have walked away. With the combination of a skillful use of modern marketing techniques, charismatic leaders, and professional praise bands, they hope to keep the comfy theater seats filled. But we're living in an age where people no longer have to accept the answers given to them by their minister, rabbi, or imam. Better answers are only a mouse click away. My hope is that religion will continue its decline, that people will look to the evidence that tells us that societies that have moved away from religion score higher on just about any metric that we use to measure societal health and human well-being. That more people will realize that we only have ourselves to look to in our search for answers to the challenges that face us. That people will realize that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is more moral than any religious text today. The basic principles in the Declaration, encompassing freedom, fairness, and equality, are not found in any holy books. Only humans can solve human problems. Solutions to our problems will not be found if we continue to think that God's guiding light of faith is a superior tool to the GPS of science. Thank you.
we welcome Dr. Andy Bannister. It's Professor Bannister, right? Or is it Doctor?
Just Andy is fine.
Okay, all right.
Doctor if you're going to be formal.
Well, no, I've been places where they've asked for a doctor and it was a professor and it just got ugly.
It's amazing what you can buy for $500 online.
You're not from Winnipeg.
I'm not. The accent probably gives that away, I guess.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I come from the UK, originally born in London, and then lived in Oxford for a while, and my wife and I moved to Toronto. I realised Toronto is a swear word in Manitoba, I apologise. We moved to Toronto about 3.5 years ago.
With your mayor now, anyway. Oh, come on. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Andy Bannister.
Well, good evening, and as Dinah said at the start of her presentation, thank you for giving up your evening to spend it with us here in the cold. And boy, is it cold. And wow, I knew it was going to be cold in Winnipeg. I had quite expected this. I have to say, I'm impressed with how you folks deal with the cold, because when we get even 5 millimetres of snow in Toronto, they call the army out. So this is particularly impressive. It's wonderful to be with you here in Winnipeg this evening. As I just said during my comments to Richard there, you'll tell by my accent that I do not hail from these parts. Although my accent is British, my wife and I have now lived in Toronto for about 4 years. And the interesting thing about living in Toronto is the question that we're exploring this evening, is there hope for the future, is a question we ask ourselves in Toronto every time the Maple Leafs hit the ice. But that's another thing entirely. However, that joking aside, I'm thrilled that we can address tonight's topic, that I have 15 minutes to speak to you on is there hope for the future, because I think it is actually one of the most vital questions that anybody can ask themselves, quite frankly. Is there hope for the future? Why is that question so important? I think I want to begin by exploring why that question is important and why we should focus on it. Why is it vital we address it? For this reason. I think hope is absolutely foundational to our lives on many, many, many levels. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly and foremostly, how you live your life right now, the choices that you make, the priorities you set, the decisions that you make, how you spend your time and your energy will be affected directly by what you ultimately place your hope in. If you ultimately place your hope in your money and career, if you ultimately place your hope in love and family, if you ultimately place your hope in love and sex, whichever of those you choose, your ultimate hope will affect how you live your life now. Your life now is a function of what you hope in. If, for example, you make the ultimate hope of your life making as much money as possible, then quite frankly, you will probably end up being a relatively shallow individual who sees other human beings as a means to an end rather than as an end in themselves. What you're hoping in will affect how you live now. That's the first reason this question is important. The second reason this question is important is because none of us can live without hope. No human being can live without hope, especially when suffering comes. Especially when suffering comes to us, as it always does at some point in our lives. One of the most influential books of the 20th century was the one on the screen behind me, Man's Search for Meaning, written by a gentleman called Viktor Frankl. He was a Jewish psychotherapist who survived 3 years imprisoned by the Nazis in the concentration camps Auschwitz and Dachau during the Second World War. When he was in the camps, as he went through the concentration camps, he was fascinated to observe, as a psychotherapist, how those people around him, how his fellow prisoners coped with the suffering, violence and agony they experienced in the concentration camps. And he noticed that people tended to respond in one of 4 ways. One of 4 ways people responded. Some people, he noted, responded to suffering by becoming brutal. They treated their fellow prisoners with hostility and with contempt. In other words, they dealt with suffering by lashing out at others. A second group of people, Frankl noticed, gave up hope, gave up life, really because they had no hope. They failed to cope with suffering because they lost hope. In that book, he tells a particularly poignant story of a good friend of his, a fellow prisoner in Auschwitz, who had a dream. And in that dream, he believed that a voice had told him that the war would end and liberation would come on the 30th of March, 1945. That belief, that dream, filled his friend with huge hope. The problem was, though, as the 30th of March drew closer, no sign of liberation came. Well, on the 29th of March, his friend developed a high fever. On the 30th of March, when it was clear that the dream had been wrong, his friend became delirious and lost consciousness. The next day, his friend was dead. He had quite literally lost all hope. Well, a third group of people, Frankl observes in this book, a third group of people, they survived the concentration camps by holding on to the hope that if they could just survive the war, if they could hold on until liberation, then eventually they could get back everything they had lost before the war, everything they had before they became prisoners. They could get back their jobs and their families and their positions and their career and their money, and that would make everything okay. And what was interesting, he noted as a psychotherapist, was that the vast majority of that group of people ended up suffering depression after the war because they discovered that no earthly pleasure could make up for the pain and suffering that they experienced. They ended up with depression. And then finally, a fourth group of prisoners that he observed found an inner strength and managed to stay hopeful, kind, and generous. And it fascinated him, and he explores in this book the reason why. And this was the conclusion he came to. He concluded that life in the concentration camps, as he expressed it, tore open the human soul and stripped away and exposed its depths. In other words, that the suffering those concentration camps imposed on people stripped away the soul and revealed something. It revealed that life, he said, can only have meaning if you have hope in something that death and suffering cannot destroy. And the reason that book has sold millions and millions and millions of copies, why it is on the top 10 bestseller lists of books in the 20th century, I think is he ends up with a profound insight. Frank ends up with this conclusion. He says the foundation of who you are is what you're living for. What you have placed your hope in will determine how you handle life now. And when suffering comes, as it will to each one of us, what suffering will do is it will expose your heart's true hope. And if you have placed your hope in something finite, then however good that thing is, and finite things can be good things, well, says Frankl, you are going to end up becoming brutal, shallow, bitter, or cynical when you lose it, when suffering strips those things away. That is why what you place your hope in, what your hope for the future is absolutely foundational. Well, interestingly, a few months ago, about 3 months ago, I was speaking at the University of Victoria, and my colleague got chatting to the head of the local Humanist Association, I guess the equivalent of Diana out there in Victoria. And interestingly, my colleague decided to ask him this question, I guess knowing this event was coming up. And he asked this humanist professor, do you have hope for the future? His answer was very interesting. He was very honest. He said, no, of course I don't have hope. I'm an atheist. He said, that's a ridiculous question. This life is all there is. It was the first time I've actually heard somebody respond that way. I admired his honesty and his willingness to say that, but on the other hand, I was saddened by that answer. Interestingly, he's in good company in giving that answer. One of the greatest minds of the 19th and 20th centuries was the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, very famous for writing books like War and Peace that you may have been subjected to at a university or high school. It's a huge, great book, and when you finish reading it, you can set fire to it and keep your house warm for 3 or 4 weeks on the size of that book. As a young man, Tolstoy enjoyed huge success as a writer. His writing brought him fame, it brought him money, it brought him influence. But then, aged 50, he had an existential crisis. He had a midlife crisis when he asked himself a simple question. Let me read you his words. Tolstoy writes, "My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man, from the foolish child to the wisest elder. It was a question without an answer to which one cannot live, as I had found by experience. It was this question, what will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Differently expressed, the question is this: why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? It can also be expressed thus: is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy?" In other words, Tolstoy realized with horror, it doesn't matter what you do, it will burn. You will die, your family will die, your friends will die, the human race too will die. Everything rots, everything decays, nothing matters, the outcome is precisely the same. Now, Tolstoy was not alone in that observation. One of my favourite philosophers and one of the greatest atheist thinkers of the 20th century was Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell comes to the same conclusion. In one of those famous essays he ever wrote, he ends up with this conclusion. It's an astonishingly honest and brilliantly written piece of writing. And he says this. He writes, "Man is the product of causes which had no provision of the ends that they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." In other words, the one thing we can be certain of is despair and hopelessness, so we better start building with that. Now that is pretty bleak stuff, and you can dismiss Russell, you can dismiss Tolstoy as pessimists, but the problem is if you simply dismiss them as pessimists, you haven't said where they are wrong. And in fact, if you dismiss them lightly as pessimists, Tolstoy would look at you and say, "You are asleep. Wake up and face reality." Well, a few years ago, social psychologist Roy Bannister wrote this book, a fascinating book called Meanings of Life. In that book, this social psychologist, sets out 4 questions that he believes have to be answered if human beings are to have hope and life is to have meaning. These are the 4 questions that Roy identifies. He says you have to answer the question of identity. Who are you? Are you just a random collocation of atoms, as Bertrand Russell would say, or are you more than that? You have to answer the question of value. Do you matter? Or are you just a cosmic accident? You have to answer the question of purpose. Why are we here? Or are you just a mere blip that when you die, nothing more has to be said? And then fourthly, you have to answer the question of agency. Can you actually make a difference? Do your choices matter? Well, as we draw this to a close, I would suggest that for me, only the Christian worldview convincingly answers those 4 questions. And interestingly, as Leo Tolstoy searched for his answers to these self-same questions, he tried science. And he found no answers there. He tried philosophy and found no answers there. He tried atheism and humanism, found no answers there either. Eventually, his years of searching led him back to the Christian faith that he had completely written off as a young man. Now that's a journey I can identify with because it's very similar to my own. In the Bible, in 1 Peter 1 verse 3 in the New Testament, we read these words. "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade." That particular book of the Bible, 1 Peter, from where I just quoted that, is a fascinating one because it was written to Christians in the 1st century who were facing persecution, imprisonment and torture by the Roman authorities who had taken an ardent dislike to the young church. Into the midst of that suffering, that pain, that persecution, Peter does not say, "Hey, don't worry about your problems, guys, it will all be okay in the end." He doesn't say that. That's often the caricature of religion, pie in the sky when you die. Peter does not say that. Rather, he says instead, because of the hope you have in who God is, in what he has done through Jesus, historically, right here, right now, you can have real comfort, real joy, real peace, real hope. How do you get this hope? Well, by believing in what the Bible calls the gospel. Putting one's trust in what Jesus has done to make a relationship with God the source of all hope possible. A relationship with God, interestingly, something Christians have talked about for 2,000 years. Because of that, says the Bible, there is a hope, an inheritance, as 1 Peter 1 verse 3 puts it, kept safe for us. That, interestingly, is a difference between Christianity and every other religion, including Islam, the religion in which I did my PhD. Every other religion says, I do something for God, and in return, he may give me something. Only Christianity says, actually, God offers us everything. and there is nothing we can do to earn it. It is a gift that must be freely accepted. Christians, we have a hope for the future, not because of a vague sense of what God might do, but because of what God has done in history, in the person of Jesus, offering us the gift of a living hope, one that transcends circumstances. I said at the start of my talk that suffering, and all of us will face suffering at some point in our lives. Suffering will expose what you're hoping in and reveal whether it is true and lasting or whether it is decaying and false. 2 years ago, my wife and I learned that lesson personally when we went through a miscarriage and lost a baby. It was one of the hardest times of our lives, and as we reflected on the experience, as we worked through it, we found ourselves drawn to this connection between hope and suffering. You see, for most people, hope is based on your circumstances. If life is going well, if everything is wonderful, then you feel hopeful. If life is going badly, if life is tough, you feel hopeless. The Christian worldview, on the other hand, says there is a hope that is much, much deeper. A hope that even if everything is stripped away, if you were to lose everything, still there is hope to be found that is deeper even than that. A hope that can be founded in Jesus. The famous preacher and evangelist Dr. Billy Graham once told of a meeting that he had with the then German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer was a very famous figure in 20th century politics because he had once been mayor of Cologne in Germany, but had been imprisoned by Hitler following the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, and then again he was imprisoned in 1944 as an opponent to the Nazis. He had gone through an awful lot in prison and had been tortured and persecuted for his political beliefs. Well, after the war, Konrad Adenauer became the Chancellor of Germany, and he was instrumental in helping pick up the shattered pieces of his country and rebuild it after what had happened. Well, at that meeting, Billy Graham tells this story. He said, when they met, Konrad Adenauer looked Billy Graham in the eye and asked him this question. He said, Dr. Graham, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? Billy Graham, a bit shocked by this question, said, well, yes, of course I do. To that confident answer, Chancellor Adenauer replied, Dr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I do not know of any other hope for our world. I completely agree with him.
Andy, thank you so very much. Again, we encourage you to text your questions, and getting some very good text questions right now. Following Shahina, we will have a 10 to 15 minute break, and we will encourage you to purchase beverages, and you'll be able to bring that back to your seats. But our third speaker, answering the question, is there hope for the future, is Shahina Siddiqui. Now, we've known each other for a few years now, and I know you came to Canada, immigrated to Canada back in the mid-70s? In 76. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the connection that you have, especially with the Winnipeg community.
Well, I'm a grandmother. I have 2 lovely grandboys. I love Winnipeg because I visited Winnipeg in 74 to visit my sister, and she wanted to impress me because I was coming from Manhattan and brought me to Winnipeg, and I just fell in love. I felt that the city had a soul. And 1 year later we were here and have never regretted a day. I would have never lived anywhere else.
And that visit, was it in January or in June?
The visit was in June. But you know what? I love winter and I love my parka. That's why I'm surviving.
Ladies and gentlemen, representing the Muslim worldview, Shahina Siddiqui.
I greet you all with the greeting of Islam. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with all of you. Only in Winnipeg you would be speaking wearing a parka. Like all of you, I think, I'm assuming, we have asked the question, why were human beings created? Because of, when you look around, the agony that we cause, the pain that we inflict, the pollution that we bring to the earth. Why did God create human beings? And the answer came to me from my tradition, where it says in the Quran that Allah created you so that you may establish worship. Worship how? Worship the Creator through the service to His creation. Worship the Creator by standing up for justice, even if it be against yourself, your kid, your kin, the rich or the poor. Worship through helping the poor, the underprivileged, the sick, and the needy. Worship through seeking knowledge, even if you have to travel long distance. Worship through speaking truth to power. Worship through elimination of persecution and oppression by anyone towards anyone. Worship through knowing people who are different from me, believe differently, look different, so that I can appreciate God's diversity in creation, so that I can learn from them, so that I can know them and not hate them. Worship through ethical stewardship of the universe, by protecting the environment, the lakes, the mountains, the oceans, the forests, and the animal kingdom. This is the purpose of my creation, as I believe and try to fulfill. And this, to me, is the meaning of why God created us. We are the only creation in this universe that has the freedom of choice. And so we are most accountable and most responsible. And we have nobody and no one to blame for our choices but ourselves. We have been asked to talk about hope. I'm reminded by a saying of our Prophet Muhammad, who said, "A believer is one who is full of hope. If you have hope, you have belief. If you don't have hope, you don't believe." And so I am extremely hopeful, in spite of the darkness around us today, in spite of the plight of humanity and God's creation around us. And why am I hopeful? Because of each and every individual here who stands up for justice, who speaks truth to power. That is why I'm hopeful, because I believe that God created human beings because we can be and are the best of creation if we follow the reason for our creation. My hope, and I will speak, I am not an academic, I only speak as a grandmother here, thinking what the future of my grandchildren will be. And I tell you that all of us want to live in peace. You have so often heard this slogan we Muslims throw out, "Oh, Islam is peace." But I don't know, even we have reflected why Islam is peace and what is peace. Just my saying peace or singing the mantra of peace, will it bring peace? Because in the Islamic frame of reference, peace cannot exist when injustice prevails. And justice cannot exist if persecution and oppression prevail. Today, if we are in conflict, we are in war, it is because we have allowed injustice to prevail and we do not stand up against oppression and persecution. Doesn't matter who the perpetrator is, doesn't matter who the victim is. We cannot choose sides when it comes to justice. No one faith, no humanist, no atheist, no agnostic has a monopoly on what is right, unless they do what is right. Our actions should speak louder than our words, and unfortunately they don't today. What is my hope? My hope is in the movement Idle No More. The grandmothers have risen, the youth are following. We must save our earth, we must save our oceans, our waterways, unless we want to leave a wasteland for our coming generations. I have hope because I think relationships building brings us together. Conversation among ourselves brings us together. Accepting that we are different and yet we are alike. Accepting and respecting that we have the right to believe what we believe. I will stand up for the rights of my colleagues with my life to allow them the space and the place to be who they are, to believe what they believe. And I would expect the same in return. Problem arises when we try to impose. Problem arises when we say, I can only be right if everybody else is wrong. I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers, because I don't. I only know what works for me, what answers my questions, just as it does for my colleagues. I know I age myself, but the hippies, we had I was not a hippie, but anyway, we had a slogan which said, live and let live. We are losing that. We are losing that. We have to reverse the tide. We must learn from the lessons of history and stand together. We have to learn from the Inquisition. We have to learn from the Crusades. We have to learn from the Holocaust. We have to learn from 9/11. We have so many lessons that the Creator has put in front of us. Let's learn and let's not repeat. And that gives me hope. We have to reject divisive politics, whether it is Quebec or whether it is our own Prime Minister. We are living in a time when politics is about divide and rule and not about bringing us together. We have to shun fear-mongers, whether they are Muslims spreading fear against Christians, atheists, or Christians spreading fears against Muslims, or atheists, or whatever. We have to shun them. We have to build Canada to show the world that there is pluralistic harmony here. And then alone, my friends, we will have peace, and not before. Thank you.
Three perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, a few words before we break for 10 minutes and we reconvene for what I promise you will be a very interesting and spirited discussion. Lots of texts coming in. We'll also have time for live questions here as well as we open up, and we have some floor mics here as well. You feel free to stand up, have a conversation with your neighbor, go and purchase a beverage. The concessions and non-alcoholic drinks are being sold here, and you can bring them back into the auditorium. And again, text your questions and we will reconvene in about 10 minutes. You also have response cards that we're going to ask you to deposit at the end of the evening. So we're back in just a little over 10 minutes. I'll give you the 5-minute warning to get back in here. So again, an appreciative round of applause now.